Hello and welcome to the Ag Culture Podcast, where we share insights about the future of agriculture. Each week we dive into the stories, technologies, and ideas shaping a profitable and sustainable future for farms and rural communities alike. I'm Paul Windemuller, host of the Ag Culture Podcast, and today I'm doing another solo episode. Now I'm really excited for this episode. We're actually not looking in the future. We'll be looking at history. I just want to first start out by saying happy birthday, 250th birthday to the United States of America this week. I know I talk a lot on this show about being able to travel the world and experience things in different geographies, but I always really appreciate being an American citizen, being born and raised in America, and I feel so blessed to have that opportunity and be a citizen of this country. And because of that, I just wanted to do something a little special for the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. Now, I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk a little bit about one of my heroes of history, as I'd like to say, George Washington. Many of you listening, even if you're not from the U.S., probably know George Washington as the first president of the United States, also the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary time period, and the presiding officer of the Constitutional Convention. Those roles that he played definitely shaped history, not only in America, but globally, and shaped the nation's politics at an early start in our national history. But I want to go a little bit deeper because that doesn't explain Washington just from those different roles. Now, I think it's probably a fair argument to say George Washington's favorite title that he liked to use for himself and how he thought of himself deeply and consistently through his life was that of a farmer. Now, many of you that aren't real history buffs, especially on Revolutionary War time period, probably don't know that about George Washington. George Washington wasn't a smallholder, subsistence living farmer at any point in his life. He was a large landowner, had a large plantation for much of his life, and grew up farming. The term back in that day, especially because of the state that he lived in, was called a Virginia planter, which meant he was a landowner, a business operator, and a manager of a large-scale agricultural estate. Now, his farming career was built inside the plantation economy of the 18th century state of Virginia, or Commonwealth of Virginia. And the reality of that was a lot of it was built upon slave labor. But within that world, Washington became one of the early Americans' most serious agricultural experimenters. He studied, corresponded, and kept records. He tested rotations of crops, tried new crops. He did genetic improvement with livestock, built processing infrastructure, invested in soil fertility, and thought about agriculture as a national project. He viewed the success of agriculture as the success of the nation. Now, why do I want to talk about this as a topic for today? Because I believe Washington's farming career matters because it connects the founding of the United States to the practical realities underneath national independence. Land, food, labor, soil, markets, transportation, knowledge, and productivity. In his mind, agriculture was not just a private business. It was part of the early republic's economic and moral foundation. He believed a nation that could feed itself, improve its land, move goods to the market, and build prosperity from its soil would be stronger, freer, and less dependent on foreign powers. Now, I think it's safe to say that that has definitely proven out over the last 250 years of American history. Now, I view Washington as not only a visionary for our founding and what America could be, but also a visionary in agriculture, offering us useful warnings and ideas at a very early stage in agricultural technology's progression. He understood many principles and values that we hold in agriculture today around soil health, around crop diversification, value-adding processing, record keeping, experimenting, and the need for reliable agricultural data. Yes, I'm talking about agricultural data in a historical context with George Washington 250 years ago. You know how excited I get about data. So it's very important, even 250 years ago, to George Washington. Now, I think it's important to understand the context of the colonial time period and the area that George Washington was farming in. Again, a lot of that rural economy was built on slave labor. So this was a direct contradiction to many of the early American ethoses of the time. And as we go through this episode, I think you'll see that George Washington really struggled with this. He understood how important it was for the success of his plantation and his farming career, but he also struggled with the principle behind equality, not equality of outcomes, equality of opportunity, and equality in the eyes of the law. So it's not a clean story, but it is a foundational story of our nation's history. Now, many of you in the United States might know of Mount Vernon, which ended up being George Washington's Virginia plantation. I had the opportunity to visit it when I visited Washington, D.C. back when I was in the 6th grade. I won't say how many years ago that was, but that was one of my favorite experiences when going to visit the Capitol. Now, it's located, I can't remember exactly how many miles outside the Capitol. I think it's 20 or 30 miles from the Capitol. And at the time, the Capitol wasn't even built when he was farming at Mount Vernon. The Capitol was actually in New York and then Philadelphia. But as a 6th grader, I remember being so impressed by the scale of Mount Vernon, first of all. And second of all of the operations and businesses and value-added things that Washington did, and then how he utilized everything. I know we talk about the circular economy in agriculture today, but Washington really had that nailed 250 years ago. It's so impressive. By the end of his life, Mount Vernon was approximately 7,600 acres, divided into several working farms. It had the Mansion House Farm, which is the most notable, Dogue Run, Muddy Hole, River Farm, and Union Farm. So 6 total farms in this one plantation. Now, what were the problems that George Washington was trying to solve as he was running this operation? They might sound familiar. He was trying to figure out how to organize labor across multiple locations. He was trying to figure out how to track production from different fields and different farms. He's trying to figure out how to reduce waste and make it a revenue stream. And he was very adamant about keeping the soil from degrading, something that was very prevalent during that time period, especially with tobacco farming in Virginia. And with that, tobacco farming's failed business model, how does one shift away from that? And as I mentioned earlier, how do you add value, higher value to products? How do you gather better information from other farmers to utilize? How do you keep managers accountable when you are not physically present? I don't know if any of these sound familiar to anyone listening that runs a large business or farm, but he was struggling with a lot of the same things. Well, not struggling, but really trying to solve the problems around a lot of the things that we still deal with today. Now, Washington's public career really forced him to be away from Mount Vernon for a very long time. During the Revolutionary War, there was a 6-year stretch where Washington didn't visit Mount Vernon even for a day. But that didn't mean he didn't stay deeply involved in Mount Vernon, even from a distance. He would constantly send instructions, demanded reports, and reviewed the accounts while questioning yields and pushing managers to execute the plans that he laid out for them. That long-distance management was often very frustrating for Washington, as he wrote about in many of his letters, but it shows how much he viewed the estate as a serious operating business. Again, he viewed Mount Vernon's success as an operation, as an agricultural enterprise, to be the United States' success. And doing some research for this episode, it was really easy to see that Washington didn't just view Mount Vernon as something that he owned. He studied it. He studied the fields. He redesigned it. He designed a wharf to be able to get his products to market and to be able to provide a new revenue stream for fishing. He expanded it, and he tried to make it a model of improved American farming. Now, I mentioned the tobacco problem earlier, and I want to dig into this a little bit deeper because I don't think most people, even in America, realize what was going on at the time in the South. Now, Washington's earliest farming career began in the tobacco world of colonial Virginia. That's just what everyone grew there. It had been the dominant cash crop of that whole Chesapeake region for generations at that time. It connected the planters, or the plantation owners, to British merchants and their credit system, the export markets, and then they imported goods. So that system in itself really had a lot of issues because it created a lot of debt obligations back to these merchants and banks back in Britain, which caused a lot of tension, which helped ignite the Revolutionary War, especially from Southern critics. And by Washington's adult life, tobacco was showing some weaknesses. Tobacco was a very labor-intensive crop, and it still is today. If you've ever seen it grown, it's still very labor-intensive. It is very hard on the soil. What you saw was a lot of times plantation owners would clear off a section of land, build a new plantation, farm it for somewhere between 8 and 15 years, run out the soil where tobacco crop wouldn't grow very well anymore, and then move further west to do the same thing again. They just run the soil out. And Washington realized this is not going to be sustainable for America's future. Washington saw that tobacco could produce some cash, but it could also trap a farmer into a declining system. And in his case, it pushed him toward debt, very, very large amounts of debt, and exposed him to market forces that he had no control over. So what was his answer? Grow more tobacco? No, it was to pivot. So by the mid-1760s, Washington began moving away from tobacco altogether and toward grain, especially wheat. This was one of the most important agricultural decisions of his life. Just remember, thinking back to that era, that time period, that area that he was in, everybody grew tobacco. That's what you did. If you try to do anything else, you were crazy. But integrating wheat as a production system at Mount Vernon altered their labor needs drastically, and it required new processing infrastructure. And it shifted his market relationships to a more local relationship rather than exporting it out of the country. And it forced him to think harder about soil fertility and crop rotation. Now, wheat brought its own risks. Obviously, you have certain pests and milling quality issues, transportation, storage, price fluctuations as well. But it gave Washington more flexibility than just having tobacco. Wheat could be consumed locally, as I mentioned, and sold commercially into milling flour or exported or eventually used in distilling. And just a quick note here, I think it's funny to note that Washington had a distillery eventually at Mount Vernon. And one of the biggest tests of George Washington's presidency was the Whiskey Rebellion that happened. I believe that was in Pennsylvania where that occurred. And it was funny because at the time, George Washington had his own distillery. So he understood in very real terms how those grain producers felt in Pennsylvania that were making this big uprise in this new country because they're being taxed on their whiskey. Okay, so let's look at Washington as an agricultural experimenter. He was an avid reader of agricultural books, and he corresponded with many people that were seen to be very progressive in soil health and cropping systems at that time, both collecting ideas from the Americas and back in Britain. So today we have the big movement around regenerative agriculture. Back in the 18th century, there was a movement in agriculture at that time many of us don't know about, and that was called New Husbandry. This movement emphasized crop rotation, soil improvement, manuring of fields, fodder crops, livestock improvement, drainage management, machinery, and rational farm management. But Washington wasn't the only American interested in these ideas, but he was probably one of the most visible and persistent at the time. There are several correspondents that Washington had in writing letters about agriculture and his experimentation. The most notable is probably with a gentleman named Arthur Young, who was a leading English agricultural writer and reformer at the time, as well as Sir John Sinclair, who was also in the British agricultural circles. Now, Washington was taking ideas from these guys over in Britain, but he really understood that farming is local. You have your local climate, soil type, labor, and markets. All of those things matter. All of those things differ in what area you're in. So he didn't merely imitate what these guys were doing, but he was definitely experimenting. He was developing his own compost and soil amendments and utilizing manure as a great source of fertilizer, as well as fish waste. And with all of this stuff, Washington kept extensive records. That's why we can still talk about this today, because there's a lot of records about what he was doing. Now, he didn't have artificial intelligence to help bring all this data together and try to find insights from it. This is what he did at night when he was conducting the war. To get his mind off of what was going on with the war, he would study his agricultural experiments that he was conducting at his farm. He was smart enough to know that agriculture had to improve through disciplined observations and shared knowledge, not just inherited customs from the past. So in terms of soil health, on top of what he was doing with composting and manuring to keep the fertility levels high in his soil, he was also very focused on developing good crop rotations. These were a central part of his efforts in understanding and improving soil health. Washington experimented with a 7-year rotation with the idea to avoid planting the same exhausting crops in the same fields year after year. His rotations included wheat, corn, a legume crop, grasses, and periods of pasture. Clover and grass were especially important because they could rest the land and provide forage and help rebuild fertility through livestock manure grazing on that. Now, I think it's really interesting to stop here and take a look. All of these things that Washington was doing at the time, he wasn't doing to try to be able to put a new label on his products coming off his farm. He wasn't having to do it because of some compliance program that he was a part of. He was doing it because he was trying to survive this vast estate that he had. How do you make it profitable? And I think that's a question we need to stop and ask ourselves today, especially with the row crop market today in the US. I know it's very, very difficult. A lot of people are not having profitable years the last couple of years. This is the same thing that George Washington ran into, but how did he overcome it? That's, I think, what we need to really look at. We need to think like George Washington thought about our operations to overcome these challenges and stay viable for the future. Now, getting back on track to improving soil health, I think one of the funniest things that I read in the letters was that George Washington had a dung repository built. That's right, a manure repository. So all of the different species of animals and livestock that he had on his farm, he took their manure and made a repository of it. And this is what he used to experiment making different composts. Now, I think it's fair to say here that as Washington did a lot of experiments, they weren't all successful. And I think that's really important for us to understand. It is great to experiment, but not all of these experiments are going to be successful. But what Washington was really trying to do was move away from a system of extractive agriculture at the time, which was the standard system, the standard business model of the time, toward improved agriculture. For him, it was about improving the productive capacity of the land over time. And that's what he viewed as stewardship. So now I want to move on to value-add operations that he had at Mount Vernon. Remember, I mentioned that he had a whiskey distillery at Mount Vernon, and I failed to mention that it was actually probably at one point the largest whiskey distillery in all of America. So not many people know that fact about our first president. He ran a grist mill for milling his own wheat. He operated a fishery, and as I mentioned earlier, the byproducts of that he used for fertilizer. He maintained a lot of livestock to be able to graze the pasture land and utilize the forages that they grew in their rotation, but also to be able to fatten out and add value to his corn and rye that he grew for animal feed. He had orchards and market gardens that could feed the household and also utilized for things like making wine. Now, what was the real driver for all of this diversification? Remember when I mentioned the standard business economics of the time in that region with tobacco, where that tobacco would flow back to Britain and the planters, the plantation owners had to deal with the financiers and the merchants from Britain, which in a lot of cases took advantage of them. It created a really bad feedback loop for these business owners, these farmers that were just doing tobacco. And George Washington's point of view was, if we can create more of our own product and keep it in our own local economy, that is going to provide greater independence as a nation. He saw agricultural diversification not just from a single farm business standpoint, but as the economic independence of our nation. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Washington's view on livestock improvement. His most passionate livestock improvement work really looked at increasing the work efficiency of the animals. And one of his most interesting projects involved mules. So he sought out high quality Spanish jacks to breed with mares or horses, believing strong mules could improve agricultural work and transportation in the new country. At the time, good mules in the United States were very scarce. Washington believed mules could offer advantages over horses for certain tasks, from strength to endurance and hardiness, with a lower feed requirement. Now, before the age of tractors, draft power was a central farm constraint. Better work animals could change how much land could be cultivated and how goods moved around and how much feed was required to take care of these animals. He saw animal breeding as part of national agricultural improvement. He was a huge early promoter of the idea that better genetics and better management around those genetics in better systems could raise the productivity of American agriculture. And a great example of this is what I discussed on an episode a few weeks ago, maybe a month or two ago now, with Nate Zwald around dairy genetics and the advancement that we've had in the United States around dairy genetics because of the focus and the data that we had to be able to put together and really make our dairy herd very, very productive. George Washington had this insight 250 years ago and was a real driver and promoter of this concept. Now, a couple points I want to make around agricultural knowledge and data that Washington brought up. In 1796, in his annual address to Congress, Washington proposed a National Board of Agriculture. The idea around it was to gather and distribute useful agricultural knowledge and answer practical questions about production, land, values, and farming conditions. Now, this is the idea that really birthed the United States Department of Agriculture and the land-grant university system, which really didn't come out until Abraham Lincoln's presidency, about roughly 65, 70 years after George Washington mentioned this in his address to Congress. But it was an idea that was really birthed with Washington. He definitely saw the need for agricultural statistics and shared knowledge and institutional support for improvement long before the United States built these structures. Now, I do want to, before we end this episode, briefly mention about the enslaved workers that Washington had on Mount Vernon. Most of these people were assigned to agricultural work on the farms, but he also had many that helped construct and operate the infrastructure that made Washington's agricultural system function. Many of these folks, Washington grew very fond of and was very close with. But from the sources of history that we have, we also know Washington was very demanding. He expected discipline, productivity, and obedience. Now, this just didn't apply to the enslaved workers that Washington had, but this is how he really brought up the military. He expected discipline, productivity, and obedience from his soldiers as well. So I think it's safe to say this was his expectation for everybody, not just enslaved workers. Now, again, I wanted to mention Washington's own views on slavery had changed over time. And in his will, he arranged for the eventual freedom of all of the enslaved people that he personally owned. Now, that decision was very significant among major founders, especially one from the Commonwealth of Virginia, which was known as probably the biggest slaveholding state at the time. As I stated earlier, I think this really shows that tension that Washington felt with the principles that he was espousing and trying to lead the country by in conflict with his own day-to-day operations in his business. Now, to wrap up, I just want to say George Washington did not create American agriculture. I'm not trying to say that in this episode. I hope you didn't get that out of this episode. But he was definitely a figure that we can look up to, much like we did with his presidency. We can look at how he viewed agriculture and the things that he did in early America to move agriculture forward. As a driving influence, this helped make America what it is today. So he first did this by helping elevate the idea of a farmer being an improver, not merely a producer, and farming as a science that could be studied, tested, measured, and improved. Second, he modeled the importance of soil fertility. He understood that land could be exhausted and that farming had to return fertility to the soil through crop rotation, manure management, uses of legumes and grasses in rotation. These were central to long-term productivity in his mind. He demonstrated value through diversification, and he moved away from the tobacco economy of the time into grains, livestock, fishing, milling, distilling, and more. He also showed the importance of value-adding processing through the grist mill and distilleries that he built at Mount Vernon. He promoted livestock improvement to improve the efficiency of American farms. And he treated record keeping and information as strategic tools. He wanted data on pretty much everything around his farm because he understood that agricultural improvement requires knowledge. He supported agricultural societies and national agricultural information systems. And finally, he connected agriculture to national independence. Washington saw farming as more than a private livelihood. He saw it as part of the economic strength and stability of the new republic. And with that, I just want to say happy birthday, America. Happy 250th anniversary. Very proud to be an American citizen. I feel very blessed, again, to say that. And I just want to say thank you for listening to my look back in history on one of my heroes of history. We will see you next week for another exciting episode of the Ag Culture Podcast. Thanks for listening.